Let's explore the foundations of comparative education. So, to understand the foundations of comparative education, that is the historical evolvement of the field, we will be looking at the three phases that have been identified by Beride 1964. Please remember as we go through these phases that these are not the ultimate phases in the sense that not everyone agrees with them, but broadly we do believe that somehow these phases were very much there. The first phase in comparative education can be called the scientific phase. The second phase can be called the prediction phase. Phase 3 can be called the analysis phase. Let's look at the scientific phase. The scientific phase has been said to extend over the early part of 19th century. The work of Marc Antoine de Paris, 1817, has been associated with this period, and he has been sort of like the one figure that stands out. Although he's not the only one, but this was a stage in which people had started to sort of look at other contexts, other country contexts, to find solutions to their problems. This phase is also known as the period of borrowing and transfer. So people would look at other contexts and they would try to find the answers to the issues they were facing in their own educational system, and they would try to find out what was it that they could borrow from that system and sort of transplant it in their own systems to make it work. If you want to look at the examples of borrowing and transfer, think of the colonial period, जिसमें आपके वेस्ट में से बहुत सारे जो schools खोले आपके ब्रिटिश ने, they were based on that kind of borrowing. There is this prediction phase. In the prediction phase can be said to begin from early 20th century. The one figure that stands out and very much his presence cannot possibly be ignored is Sir Michael Sadler, who was a high official in the US, and he sort of started paying attention to the context of education. He said we can't possibly actually go and borrow what is being done in other educational contexts and transplant it in our own context without actually understanding what are the social forces that have led them to make certain educational decisions. And so even if you want to bring in some aspects of education learn some lessons from some other country context, you cannot possibly think of those lessons as denude them of context. So you have to keep in mind the context within which those educational institutions have developed. And then only you can sort of think what is going to work in our own system and what is not going to work in our system. The third phase that Beride 1964 talks about is the phase in which people started to pay attention to the process of analysis. Now, so they started to think of it or started to perceive of it as a field, and there was a lot of emphasis on the methodology that was being used. So where in earlier phases, they were only talking of observations or personal observations, and the comparison was sort of, there were no, what I would say, no clear-cut ways in which comparison could be done. Now the focus was on methodology, and it was realized that unless there are clear-cut lines along which comparison can be done, you cannot possibly the results will not be very reliable. So over here in this phase, people started to pay attention to the methodology or analysis or interpretation of the data. If we want to think about the interpretation of data, में क्या issues आ सकते हैं? For instance, take this example of Africa, जहाँ पे they were looking at this equity issue के males और females का gender equity जिनकी उनकी access है वो एक जैसी है कि different है. तो data showed कि there was a rise in equity. So there was now, after some years, there was an equal number of boys, almost equal number or a better difference between boys and girls accessing education. लेकिन when they looked at the data carefully, they realized कि actually लड़कियों का number increase नहीं हुआ, लड़कों का number जो कि स्कूल जा रहे थे वो decrease हो गया because of poverty. So over here in this phase, somehow the attention was drawn to issues of analysis and methodology. So comparisons could be done along scientific lines. So the emphasis was to have clear procedures and processes in line if any sort of comparison was to be helpful in making educational decisions.